This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Good afternoon, and welcome to PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing Forward. I am your host, Brittany Mellinger, and I serve as the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. In this show, we explore all things housing with the experts, advocates, and community leaders working to expand access to housing. Today, we'll be discussing PHRC's work in enforcing fair housing laws, focusing on central Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show PHRC Harrisburg Regional Office Director Heather Roth. Heather joined the PHRC in January of 2013 as the Regional Director for the Harrisburg region. Prior to this role, Roth spent 15 years in the field of human resources management. Roth has served in multiple senior manager roles and has directed the human resources functions for multi-site and multi-state organizations. Roth holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Penn State University, where she studied public relations. Roth has held professional certifications in human resources since 2004. She obtained her SBHR, which is the Senior Professional in Human Resources certification from the Human Resource Certification Institute in 2010, and it still holds it today. Roth was accepted as a member of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Leadership Network in 2016 and assists with providing ADA training on behalf of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. Roth received 2 awards from the Commonwealth in 2016, including a Transformation Award from the Governor's Office of Innovation for her role in developing the Commission's online questionnaire, and the Education and Outreach Award from the Commission for her work in educating the public. Roth also received the Executive Director's Excellence Award in 2021 from the Commission. She has received various other awards for her work in planning the Commission's disability conferences and her speaking engagement at the Commission's Sexual Harassment Conference. Welcome to the show, Director Roth. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So we all have a story on how we got to our current work and vocation. Could you share with our audience a little bit about your journey to your current work?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, I graduated with a degree in public relations. I had a big dream. I was going to go to New York City and get a job in one of those big firms. And then I realized New York was really cold and you had to walk a lot, and I didn't like either one of those. So when I got out of college, I kind of stumbled into human resources, started as a recruiter, worked my way up to a regional director of human resources, and I thought that's where my career would stay. But as fate has it, I was with a company who had a merger, and I had to decide if I wanted to move down south to keep my position or look for something new. And as fate had it, this regional director position was open, and the more I read, the more I knew that that's where I was meant to be. So I've been here now for 12 years.
That's amazing. So you're regional director of the Harrisburg Regional Office. What area of the state does that cover?
Well, it covers most of the state. Our region is actually, I call it central Pennsylvania, but it's the 34 counties from top to bottom and in the middle. So we basically go all the way to the Pittsburgh line and all the way down to the Philadelphia line, and we cover everything that's in the middle there. So quite a broad area.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell our audience a little bit about the work that goes on in your office?
Sure. We have a great staff. I always want to start by saying that. None of the work would get done without the folks that are there. I like to think of myself there as the regional director, as support for the staff, help guide and direct the investigations, the intakes, work with legal on cases that we decide that we're going to pursue in the court, so to speak, and also come out and do things like this and educate the public on discrimination, how to file a complaint, also visit places that might be the subject of a discrimination complaint and help them educate their staff, their managers, to prevent complaints from being filed and from discrimination happening to begin with.
Yeah. So I know you can't go into a lot of details that would breach any confidentiality in cases, but could you speak more generally about what trends you're seeing these days?
Well, it's funny because discrimination seems to repeat itself. Sometimes there's certain groups of individuals that are discriminated against. For instance, during 2020 and with the COVID pandemic, we saw a spike in all kinds of cases against Asian Americans because there was a bias at that time. Now we continue to see many complaints that are disability related, mostly folks with disabilities, but certainly some other categories. And that's across the board. That's employment, housing, education. Lately, we're seeing a lot of education complaints coming in, K through 12th grade, where students are being bullied and harassed. And unfortunately, the educators are not handling it well. We're also now seeing, because of some changing law, which I think we'll talk about a little bit, more complaints from pregnant workers coming in who have been denied accommodations. So right now, I would say those are the three biggest trends I see, but certainly tomorrow there could be a new one. It really depends on what's going on in the state and the country.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you've been at PHRC for 12 years now, which is a good chunk of time. Can you talk a little bit about the changes that you've seen at PHRC over that period of time?
Yeah, well, lots of things have changed in 12 years, believe it or not. Since I've been here, we've added more protections under sex. We've added regulations to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So that has brought another group of folks into us filing complaints, unfortunately. We've seen marijuana become legalized medically in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the federal government does still see that as a Schedule I drug, so the ADA does not cover those folks when they need that as an accommodation for their disability. Here in Pennsylvania, we construe things a little more broadly, a little more liberal with our interpretations, and we've taken the stance that folks with disabilities that use medical marijuana may be entitled to accommodations depending on what their job is. So we've definitely taken a different look at that. And then recently, federally, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act passed, which now provides pregnant workers the ability to get accommodations, where in the past it wasn't quite so straightforward. So we're now looking at those cases a little bit more differently, looking at more protections for that group of employees. So things change when the law changes, sometimes federally, sometimes within the state, but we definitely start to look at our cases a little differently each time there's a new case or each time a law is amended or added. So they would be some examples in the last 12 years.
Yeah, I can imagine for those individuals having those additional protections can be absolutely life-changing.
Absolutely.
So have there been changes in the way that we actually go about investigations and cases that you've noticed?
Well, I will say this. We are very diligent at looking at our investigative procedures on a very regular basis. We get feedback from the folks that are doing the work, the division managers, to make sure that we're on point, we're on track, and that we're being effective. We have made some tweaks over the years. One of the biggest things I think that has changed and that has been just a game changer for some complainants is how we look at mediation. As you know, we have a mediation division. We offer free mediation services for almost all of our complaints. And now, as soon as the respondent answers our complaint, we proactively offer those mediation services to both parties. So they can avail themselves of our services. Sometimes these cases, they don't even have to be investigated. Our mediators, again, just like my staff, are terrific. We have 2 terrific mediators right now, and they have been so successful. Almost all of the cases that have come to them, they've been able to do some mediation. So that is one of the big things. The investigation, it's pretty standard. Each case obviously is a little different, depending on the allegations, depending on the facts of the case, but we try to follow a pretty standard way so that everybody gets the same investigation. So that really hasn't changed. I think the methods sometimes on how we get evidence, sometimes we have to go on site when folks maybe are not cooperative. Sometimes we have to talk to people outside of their work hours, if they're not comfortable being a witness and talking during work. We change up from case to case, but I'm not sure that we've changed our procedures so much, over the 12 years, because we know how we do it works. So we keep that basic model.
Yeah, it's a good thing to have consistency in your process and to make sure that everyone's getting a fair investigation. But certainly understand that the flexibility in tactic can also be really, really helpful as well. So this is a housing show, so I do want to make sure that we're focusing in on housing as well. Can you talk a little bit about the biggest issues that you're seeing in our housing cases these days?
Well, I think there's a few that come up more than others. Two of the biggest things that we see, won't be a surprise based on what I said earlier, revolves around folks with disabilities. Mm-hmm. People often need their housing providers to make an accommodation in their policies or practices so that they can enjoy their housing. One of the things, as an example, that maybe someone wouldn't think of, folks with disabilities, sometimes their only income is their Social Security disability income. Mm-hmm. And maybe it doesn't come until the 10th of the month. We have folks that will ask for an accommodation in their rent policy. Can I please pay my rent on the 10th of every month instead of the 1st? And many housing providers say no. That's not something that we'll do. But that would be some accommodation that we would require if asked. One of the other things that we see are folks that need modifications to their housing units. Most of the time, the folks that are in the housing are the ones that will pay for those accommodations or those modifications. And a lot of times the housing providers will simply say no. I'll talk a little bit later about two examples of that, but it can be very small. Something as small as adding something to a bathroom, or it could be something a little bit larger that might need a little bit more construction. But under the law, allowing them to make a modification to allow them to use their housing is something that is generally required. I see those two things quite a lot. The other thing we see in housing quite frequently is folks with disabilities that either have service animals or they might have emotional support animals. And their housing providers say, sorry, we have a no pet policy. But unfortunately, service animals and emotional support animals, they're not considered pets. They're an extension of the person. They're something that they need, again, as an accommodation. So that issue comes up quite frequently. Other things we see on a more regular basis, violations of our familial status policies, where landlords think it's okay to tell folks that if they have kids under 18, they won't allow them to be in that unit, or they'll allow them to move in, but they can't be on that third floor, or because there's a balcony, or they think it's a safety issue, or maybe they can have the children, but they can only stay in one part of the apartment complex because they don't want to disturb other guests. And a lot of folks just don't understand that that's also unlawful. So those are the big things. Certainly we get a lot of folks that get evicted for various reasons. We have folks, unfortunately, that get harassed in housing, whether it be by employees of the housing provider or other tenants, neighbors, that kind of thing. But definitely the accommodations and the modifications and the service animals are definitely the biggest ones.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to explain that to us. Your region, as you mentioned earlier, is pretty broad. You cover a big chunk of Pennsylvania, which is a big and diverse state. It covers everything from small communities up in the mountains to farming communities to some sizable cities too, up into the Northeast, which is really close to New York City and other really big metropolitan areas. Can you talk a little bit about the variation between areas and how that impacts housing concerns?
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and I couldn't say like county by county that there's one kind of discrimination versus another, but I think what does make a difference is the rural communities versus more city communities. We tend to see in our rural communities a lot more mom and pop housing providers that just maybe are not quite as up to date on their knowledge of especially discrimination laws when it comes to housing. Whereas in the cities, you tend to have folks, housing providers that have more units, they're more experienced, little more knowledgeable. So the kind of discrimination you see in our rural places seems to be more blatant. Just because they don't know. And in the city areas, it certainly still happens just as much, but maybe it's not as blatant. It's more hidden, if you will. We also see a lot in the rural areas, a little bit more racial discrimination, I think, just because a lot of our rural areas here in Pennsylvania, they're mostly Caucasian. So when we get communities that have folks coming in from outside the community that look different, sound different than them, oftentimes, they are discriminated against. There's a bias towards them. They may behave the same as other tenants, but they're held to different standards because maybe the other tenants aren't comfortable with them. So we tend to see that in the rural communities. Other than that, again, there's discrimination in every county. I hate to say it. And the same kind of things happen, in the cities and in the rural areas. It's just, I think, a matter of how much knowledge those housing providers have and what kind of makeup, is the population and the community in those areas.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I wouldn't be fulfilling my role as training coordinator for PHRC without mentioning that we do offer free housing training to housing providers that are interested in learning more. I know that you are deeply involved with providing training to housing providers when it's required as part of a settlement for a housing case. And as you're interacting with those housing providers in that training setting, there's a lot of questions that come up. Could you talk a little bit about some of the areas where housing providers might not know the law as well, or things that trip a lot of people up?
Sure. And I'll just say I love to go out and do training. I love it even more when people call us before they're in trouble and have us come in and talk to them, especially when they see there might be, some concerns with their staff or their management. Things that I see a lot that people are surprised about, I keep going back to it, but the service animal and especially the emotional support animal issue, housing providers are very confused as what they can ask their tenants for, what's required to be able to approve something like that. Many folks think that housing providers, that they're entitled to their tenants' medical records, and they're really not. There's certain limitations that they have on what they can obtain. Although background checks are not specifically protected under the PHRA, how they use their background checks to weed tenants in or out, so to speak, is an area of confusion. We try to, let folks know that certain people may be more apt to have things in their background than others, and it could turn into a case of discrimination, depending how they're applying it. So having that conversation to make sure that their requirements make sense, to make sure that they give each person that wants to be a tenant there an individual assessment and give them an opportunity perhaps to explain if they have something. And that familial status thing, that comes up a lot too. Many landlords don't understand why they can't say no kids. A lot of folks say it's my property, it's my choice. And you have to gently educate and let them know why that's not okay, at least not here in Pennsylvania. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So there may be viewers watching our show today that might realize that, hey, I think I actually may have experienced discrimination and want to file a complaint with our agency. What do you think they should know about starting the process to file a complaint?
Well, the one thing I always tell folks is please understand that our investigators are neutral and unbiased. They're here to get the facts. So they're going to ask you some tough questions. They're going to ask those tough questions to the folks that they want to file against too. So they have to be prepared for the investigation. If folks are experiencing discrimination, if they have any evidence, text messages, emails, voicemails, documents, witnesses that they can obtain or provide to the investigation, it is so helpful for us and it makes the investigation go smooth. one of the other things I just want to let everybody know is it will take several months to get through the investigation. So if you are experiencing discrimination, if you are able, they should go to that employer or that housing provider and at least try to rectify it with them first. Because a lot of times they can. A lot of times the employer or the housing provider doesn't even know what's going on. And they will make changes if they're made aware. An investigation is hard for both sides, so if they can resolve it, with the other party first, that's always the outcome that we're all looking for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Would you be able to share an example or two of some recent housing cases that were handled by your office?
Sure. I actually have two, and one is actually not from our office, but I thought it was relevant to the conversation. We recently held a public hearing in which the commission erred in favor of the complainant. The complainant was an individual with mobility, a mobility issue, and she simply required that she put grab bars in her shower so that she could get in and out. And the respondent denied her request. Now, for what reason, we still don't understand. That individual suffered emotional distress. She was not able to live the way that she normally would live. She wasn't able to enjoy her housing. And for those that don't know, in our act, we are able to award damages for what we call embarrassment and humiliation. And she was awarded $60,000 for that. So for the housing providers that are listening, a $10 grab bar that she was willing to pay for and install herself cost that respondent $60,000 for not doing it. The other case, similar but on, I think, maybe a little bit greater scale of what was needed, we actually have a public hearing scheduled at the end of this month. You could go on our website for details. But we had a gentleman who became disabled during the course of living in his apartment and could no longer traverse to the second floor of his apartment. He needed to have a chairlift installed. He had a community partner that was willing to pay for it, willing to install it, and the housing provider wouldn't let him. They actually indicated that they had measured the unit and that it wouldn't work, and the investigation later found out that they never had even come out and measured. That public hearing is scheduled for the end of the month, and I think anyone that might be interested in seeing the kind of work we do and how our investigation plays out, look on our website. It'll be in the York area at the end of January, and I think it would be a very eye-opening experience for anyone that would like to come and join us.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about this in broad generalities, but it's something else to hear about the specifics of a case and how it impacts an individual.
Absolutely.
So I can't imagine that your job is easy, and I imagine that you have some really hard days hearing about the impacts of discrimination on people's lives. Can you talk a little bit about what keeps you going on those tough days?
Yeah, I mean, after being here for 12 years, there's so many things that go on in our Commonwealth that I would never have believed before I saw these complaints. It is frustrating sometimes when we have cases where we really believe that someone was discriminated against, but we just simply can't get the witnesses to come forward or the evidence to support the case. Those are difficult days. But for every one of those, we have another individual that we can help in one way or another. I know that many folks do not have the resources to get an attorney and to take their case to court. So we kind of are their last option. And I take that very seriously. I know that we need to do good investigations. We need to uncover every stone that we can. And sometimes, unfortunately, we find it wasn't discrimination. Sometimes we find maybe the employer just wasn't fair or didn't have good policies. I don't consider those losses necessarily. I think that gives closure to the people, whether it's an employee or a housing tenant. Sometimes things just aren't done well, and our investigation will help guide new policies or practices. So every day that's hard, I think, for every person that we helped in some manner, whether it was a settlement, whether it was a policy change, whether it was just they had closure, I know that the hard days are worth it. So that's what keeps me going.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and to share about your work, and thank you for the leadership you provide to our agency. I'd also like to thank our viewers for spending their afternoon learning with us. If you believe that you've experienced housing discrimination or would like to learn more about housing protections in Pennsylvania, give us a call at PHRC's Fair Housing Line, which is 855-866-5718. You can also find us at our website on the screen, which is www.pa.gov/en/agencies/PHRC. You can also keep up with our work on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And remember, our communities are stronger when everyone has a place to call home. We'll see you next time.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.